Welcome to Avoidant Decoded. I'm someone who works closely with people who have avoidant attachment patterns, and over time, I've noticed something important. Avoidant individuals may look emotionally distant on the outside, but their inner world is often far more complicated than it appears. Working with people over time gives you a different perspective than simply reading about attachment in a book. You get to see how relationships develop, how romantic connections change, how family experiences influence behavior, and how stress from work and everyday life affects emotional patterns. Relationships come up constantly because they're often where avoidant people experience the greatest amount of confusion. They may want connection while simultaneously feeling uncomfortable with too much emotional closeness. One thing that has stood out to me repeatedly is the connection between emotional suppression and anger. Not every avoidant person struggles with anger, of course, but many people who have difficulty expressing sadness, fear, disappointment, or vulnerability eventually find those emotions coming out in another form. When someone grows up learning that certain feelings are unsafe, unacceptable, or simply something they should handle alone, those feelings don't disappear. They can remain buried until frustration becomes the emotion that feels easiest to express. This can happen in anyone, although I've noticed it particularly often in avoidant men. That brings us to a question many people ask. How do you know when an avoidant person has genuinely developed a deep emotional attachment? And perhaps the more important question is, what kind of person does an avoidant actually become attached to? Avoidant individuals are often selective about who they allow into their emotional world. They may take a long time to trust someone, and they don't necessarily express attachment through constant affection, reassurance, or romantic intensity. Their deepest bonds are often built through something much quieter: safety, consistency, acceptance, and repeated experiences that show them the relationship isn't going to become emotionally overwhelming. One of the strongest qualities that can make an avoidant person feel safe is having a partner who can disagree without turning disagreement into a war. This sounds simple, but it can be incredibly powerful. If every difference of opinion becomes an argument where someone has to prove they're right, the avoidant person may quickly feel pressured or trapped. Imagine hearing someone calmly say, "We don't have to agree on everything." That statement communicates much more than tolerance. It tells the avoidant person that having a different opinion doesn't make them unacceptable. They don't have to defend themselves, surrender their position, or worry that disagreement will lead to rejection. Interestingly, when avoidant people stop feeling pressured to change, they can sometimes become much more willing to compromise. Their resistance isn't always about the actual subject being discussed. Sometimes they're protecting their independence. If compromise feels like giving up part of themselves just to keep someone happy, they naturally resist. But when they know they are accepted as they are, compromise becomes less threatening. They can consider another perspective without feeling that their identity or freedom is being taken away. Consistency is another major factor. Avoidant attachment rarely disappears because of one beautiful conversation or one intense romantic moment. Trust is usually developed through repetition. It comes from seeing the same person behave in a dependable way over and over again. This doesn't mean you should stay in an unhealthy relationship simply to prove that you're loyal. Boundaries, respect, and emotional well-being still matter. But when an avoidant person experiences someone who has been stable, supportive, and dependable for a long period of time, that history can become extremely meaningful. Avoidant people often need evidence before they feel emotionally secure. They watch what happens after disagreements. They notice whether someone disappears, becomes controlling, demands perfection, or uses vulnerability against them. Over time, every positive experience becomes another piece of evidence that the relationship is safe. For that reason, a person who has consistently shown up through different stages of life can become deeply important to an avoidant individual. Dramatic declarations may feel less meaningful than years of reliable behavior. Time itself becomes proof. Another quality that often creates strong emotional attachment is self-awareness. Avoidant individuals tend to respect people who can look honestly at their own behavior instead of automatically blaming their partner. For example, imagine someone realizes that they have been sending repeated messages while their partner is working because they were feeling anxious and wanted reassurance. Instead of demanding that their partner become constantly available, they recognize their own behavior and say, "I realize my anxiety was affecting the situation, and I'm working on handling that differently." That kind of accountability can be extremely powerful. It tells the avoidant person that they're not the only one being asked to change. The relationship becomes a shared process rather than a situation where one person is constantly being diagnosed, corrected, or blamed. Avoidant individuals often feel more comfortable around emotional maturity than emotional chaos. When someone can examine their own behavior without becoming defensive, it reduces pressure. It creates the feeling that both people are responsible for making the relationship healthier. This connects directly to another important quality: sincere apologies. A healthy relationship requires accountability from both people. One person shouldn't constantly apologize while the other refuses to take responsibility. But when an avoidant person sees their partner acknowledge a mistake honestly and without manipulation, it can make vulnerability feel much safer. Imagine saying, "I'm sorry I kept messaging you while you were working. I realize my anxiety was affecting you and I understand that it probably added stress to your day. I'm going to work on handling that differently." That isn't weakness, it's emotional maturity. For an avoidant person, an apology like that can communicate, "Your experience matters to me too." It shows them that their feelings aren't being ignored. And when someone consistently demonstrates that kind of accountability, the avoidant may gradually become more willing to acknowledge their own mistakes. The relationship stops feeling like a competition where one person has to win. Instead, it becomes a partnership where both people can admit, "I could have handled that better." That sense of equality can be incredibly important because many avoidant individuals fear becoming responsible for another person's emotional world. When they see that their partner can manage their own emotions, reflect on their behavior, and communicate responsibly, emotional closeness becomes much less threatening. Another quality that matters is the ability to remain grounded when circumstances aren't exactly what you hoped they would be. Consider a relationship where one partner wants to spend time together every other day because frequent contact makes them feel connected. The other partner may have a demanding career, family responsibilities, or simply a stronger need for solitude. At that particular point in life, they may only feel comfortable seeing their partner once a week. Neither person is automatically wrong. Their needs are simply different. Now imagine the avoidant partner finally says, "I care about you, but I can't realistically promise to see you every other day right now. Once a week is what I can manage with everything happening in my life." That admission can actually be vulnerable for an avoidant person. They're revealing a limitation and risking the possibility that their partner will reject them for it. One response would be to attack them. "If you really loved me, you'd want to see me more. Something is wrong with you. No one who cares would behave like this." That reaction teaches the avoidant person a painful lesson. Honesty leads to punishment. And when that happens, their defenses often become stronger. But imagine responding differently. "I'm disappointed because I wanted more time together, and being together matters to me. But I appreciate you being honest instead of promising something you can't realistically give. I'm willing to work with this for now, and we can revisit it when circumstances change." That response doesn't mean abandoning your needs. You're still communicating what matters to you. You're simply doing it without shaming the other person. For an avoidant individual, that distinction can be enormous. They learn that vulnerability isn't automatically punished. Honesty doesn't immediately create conflict. They can communicate their limitations without being attacked. And ironically, that freedom can make them more willing to move toward their partner. When someone doesn't feel cornered, they may eventually think, "This person understands me. Maybe I can gradually give more." Peace is another quality that often strengthens an avoidant person's emotional attachment. This doesn't mean avoiding serious conversations or pretending problems don't exist. Healthy relationships require difficult discussions. The difference is how those discussions are handled. If emotions become too intense and neither person is thinking clearly, there's nothing wrong with saying, "We're not getting anywhere right now. Let's pause and come back to this when we're both calmer." That isn't necessarily avoidance. Sometimes it's emotional regulation. You can still return to the issue later. You can still express your feelings, establish boundaries, and find a solution. The important part is recognizing that continuing to argue while both people are overwhelmed often creates more damage than progress. For an avoidant person, learning that conflict doesn't automatically mean emotional disaster can be transformative. They begin to understand that disagreement doesn't equal rejection. An argument doesn't have to become a breakup. A difficult conversation doesn't have to turn into hours of emotional chaos. Sometimes taking a break, having dinner together, going for a walk, watching something, or simply giving each other some breathing room can help both people regulate before returning to the issue. That communicates something very powerful. The relationship matters more than winning. Another quality that can create deep trust is allowing room for ordinary human mistakes. Nobody gets everything right all the time. People forget things. They misjudge situations. They lose track of time. They occasionally fail to follow through exactly as planned. For an avoidant person, knowing that a small mistake won't become a massive emotional crisis can make the relationship feel much safer. Imagine a couple agrees that one partner will spend an evening with friends and come home around 1 a.m. because they have responsibilities the next morning. The person doesn't return until 2 a.m. The next day, they admit it openly. There are two very different ways this could be handled. One response might involve accusations, suspicion, and insults. Where were you really? Why didn't you care about our agreement? What's wrong with you? That approach may turn a relatively small mistake into a much larger emotional conflict. A healthier response could be, "Thank you for telling me. I asked you to be home by 1 because we had a busy morning planned, and now we'll have to adjust things. I understand that mistakes happen, but I'd appreciate it if we could stick to our agreement next time because it affects both of us." Notice the difference. The mistake wasn't ignored. The boundary wasn't erased. The disappointment was communicated clearly, but there was no humiliation. That's often the balance avoidant people respond well to. They don't need someone who accepts every behavior without question. They need someone who can hold them accountable without making them feel like one mistake defines their entire character. Tolerance doesn't mean having no standards. It means responding proportionately. When avoidant individuals experience this kind of environment repeatedly, something important can happen. They begin to believe they can be imperfect without losing the relationship. They can admit mistakes, they can apologize, they can have different opinions, they can express limitations, they can ask for space, and they can still be loved and respected. That is emotional safety. When you put all of these qualities together, a clear pattern emerges. Avoidant individuals often form their strongest emotional bonds with people who don't require constant agreement, who remain dependable over time, who understand their own behavior, who can apologize sincerely, who communicate disappointment without attacking, who value calm resolution over unnecessary drama, and who understand that ordinary mistakes don't have to become relationship emergencies. This doesn't mean you should become endlessly patient, tolerate disrespect, suppress your needs, or reshape yourself just to keep an avoidant person comfortable. A healthy relationship has two people in it. Your needs matter just as much as theirs. The goal isn't to chase an avoidant person or learn the perfect behavior that will make them commit. The goal is to understand what genuine emotional safety looks like while maintaining your own self-respect and boundaries. Avoidant attachment doesn't mean someone is incapable of love. It often means closeness can bring up complicated fears around dependence, vulnerability, rejection, control, or losing independence. Because of that, trust may develop differently. For some avoidant people, love doesn't arrive as a dramatic emotional explosion. It grows quietly through thousands of ordinary moments. Someone keeping their word, listening without judging, respecting boundaries, admitting when they're wrong, handling conflict without creating chaos, and remaining emotionally steady when life becomes difficult. Eventually, those experiences can become more powerful than words. The avoidant person begins to realize, I can be myself here. I don't have to constantly defend myself. I can tell this person what I need. I can make mistakes and still be respected. We can disagree without destroying each other. And when that realization becomes deeply rooted, emotional attachment can become incredibly strong. If you're trying to understand an avoidant partner, rebuild trust, or create a healthier relationship, remember that emotional security isn't created by pressure. It's developed through repeated experiences of respect, honesty, stability, accountability, and mutual understanding. The strongest bond isn't necessarily the relationship with the most intensity. Sometimes it's the relationship where both people finally feel safe enough to lower their defenses. Thank you for spending this time with Avoidant Decoded. If this discussion helped you understand avoidant attachment from a deeper perspective, support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts. And remember, healthy connection isn't about chasing someone until they stop running. It's about creating a relationship where both people can remain themselves while choosing freely and consistently to grow closer together. If there is one thing you should take away from everything we've discussed, it is this. An avoidant person does not necessarily become deeply attached because you chase harder, love louder, or constantly reassure them. Their deepest attachment often develops in the quiet spaces where they experience something they may have struggled to trust before: emotional safety. They begin to bond with the person who can disagree without turning differences into battles, communicate disappointment without humiliation, respect boundaries without becoming distant, and remain consistent without creating pressure. They notice the person who doesn't demand perfection, but still maintains healthy standards. They remember the person who can say, I understand, without pretending that everything is acceptable. And over time, those small moments begin to carry more emotional weight than dramatic declarations ever could. An avoidant person may not always show attachment in the obvious ways you expect. They may not constantly express how much they care. They may need space, take longer to open up, or struggle to put their feelings into words. But when they repeatedly experience someone who is calm, trustworthy, self-aware, accountable, and emotionally balanced, something begins to change beneath the surface. Their nervous system starts learning that closeness does not automatically mean losing freedom. Vulnerability does not automatically lead to rejection, conflict does not automatically mean abandonment, and love does not have to feel like emotional chaos. That is where genuine trust begins. The person they become most deeply connected to is often not the person who tries hardest to hold on to them, but the person who creates enough safety for them to choose connection willingly. That doesn't mean becoming endlessly patient with unhealthy behavior, accepting neglect, ignoring your own needs, or waiting forever for someone to change. You should never have to abandon your boundaries just to make another person comfortable. A healthy relationship requires two people who are willing to participate, communicate, take responsibility, and grow. Your emotional needs matter too. The real goal is not to figure out how to manipulate an avoidant person into becoming attached. The goal is to understand what healthy attachment actually requires from both sides. When an avoidant person discovers that they can be loved without being controlled, understood without being analyzed, challenged without being attacked, and given space without being abandoned, they may finally begin lowering the walls they've spent years building. And once those walls come down, you may discover that the person who seemed emotionally distant was never incapable of deep feeling. They simply needed enough safety to trust what they were feeling. Remember, emotional attachment is rarely built through one perfect conversation. It is built through patterns. It is built when your words match your actions. It is built when apologies are genuine, disagreements remain respectful, mistakes are handled with proportion, and both people understand that being different does not mean being incompatible. The strongest relationships aren't necessarily the ones filled with constant passion or endless reassurance. Sometimes they're the ones where two people can sit in silence and still feel secure, disagree and still feel connected, take space and still know the relationship exists, make mistakes and still feel respected, and face difficult moments without turning against one another. That kind of connection gives love somewhere safe to grow. So if you're dealing with an avoidant partner, don't measure their feelings only by how quickly they respond, how often they express affection, or how emotionally intense they appear to be. Look at the larger pattern. Look at whether they gradually become more open. Look at whether they trust you with more of themselves. Look at whether they return after needing space, whether they begin communicating more honestly, whether they make room for you in their life, and whether their actions increasingly reflect commitment. Those changes may be subtle, but subtle does not mean meaningless. At the same time, don't lose yourself trying to decode someone else's behavior. You deserve a relationship where your needs are heard, your feelings are respected, and your presence is valued. Love should not require you to constantly prove your worth. The healthiest connection happens when both people move toward each other, not when one person spends their entire life chasing while the other remains permanently unavailable. Ultimately, the deepest lesson is simple. Safety creates trust, trust creates vulnerability, vulnerability creates intimacy, and intimacy creates the possibility of genuine emotional attachment. You cannot force that process, but you can recognize it when it begins. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer another person is not more pressure, more questions, or more pursuit. It is consistency, honesty, emotional maturity, and the freedom to be human without fear. When two people can create that environment together, attachment stops being something one person has to chase and becomes something both people naturally choose. That is where a relationship can move beyond fear and into something much deeper, something steady, mutual, authentic, and capable of lasting.